All right, so now we want to display the user's repositories. I want to display it down here. And we're going to have separate components for that. We'll have a repos component, and then we'll have a repo item for each one. And this is the endpoint we want to hit. We want to be able to get the first 5 or the latest 5 repositories, and there's some parameters we can add to the endpoint to do that. So I think the first place I want to start is creating the actual function, which is going to be in our app.js where everything else is, all of our other requests. So I'm going to go under the get user, and let's say get users repos. And I'll just copy the get user because it's kind of similar. So we'll call this, let's say get user repos. And it's going to take in the username just like get user did, because we need to know which user we're dealing with. Except instead of just /user/username, we're going to say /username/repos. Okay, and then we're going to add some extra parameters here. So after the question mark, let's say per_page equals, and let's do 5, and then an ampersand, and let's say sort. Okay, so we want to basically, we want the most recent first, so we'll say sort equals created, and this is just part of the GitHub API, and then we can put a colon, and if we want it descending or ascending, I'm going to do ASC for ascending. Okay, and then we'll just put an ampersand and then continue on with the client ID stuff. So that's what we want to do, and then down here when we set the state, we're actually going to have the repos in our state, and it's going to be res.data. So let's make sure we add that up here to our state. So we'll say repos, and that's going to be an array. So let's just set that to an empty array. In fact, I'm going to move that up here like that. And that should be it for our global state here. So we have this method. Now we're going to want to call this within our user component. So down here where we embed our user component, just like we have get user, let's do get user repos. Okay, and we'll call this get user repos. And then from within the component, we simply have to call this.props.get user repos. Now we also want to pass in the repos state, right? So let's go right here and let's say repos equals the repos that are in the state. Okay, it says repos is not defined. That's because we need to pull it out right here where we destructured everything else like that. All right, so this should be all set. Now let's go into user.js. Now, let's see. I mean, you could do this in a few different ways. You could call the get repos from the repos component, but then you'd have to pass it up twice. That's called prop drilling, when you keep passing up props through components, because we're actually going to embed the repos here, the repos component. So I'm just going to call it right when we call get user, which is up here in the component did mount. So let's go get user repos, and again we need to pass in the username or the login. This is a prop, so we want to add right here get user repos, and that's PTFR. So we'll call that. Let's save it, and if we go back to our user page here and we look in our app state, so under repos you'll see I get 5 options or 5 objects in my array with that information. Now we could just stick it right in the user component, but with React, with any front-end framework that's component-based, you want to break everything up. So I'm actually going to create another folder in components, close these up, and let's create a folder called repos, and we're going to have a file called repos.js, and then for each one we're going to have a file called repoitem.js. So repos is going to be pretty simple. We're just basically going to create a list. We're going to map through the repos that are passed in. So let's create a function component, so RACF, and it's going to get passed in props, and I'm going to just destructure and pull out the repos. And then for the return, we can actually just get rid of this, and we can return repos.map, which will basically loop through them. I'll say for each one, we'll call it repo. And then we want to display a repo item component where we pass in the individual repo, like that. Okay, and it's going to need a key because it's a list. So for the key, I'll use the repo ID, like that. And that should work. Now this is a prop, so we need a prop type. So let's say repos.prop types. And we actually need to bring in prop types. All right, so we'll add in here repos, which is going to be an array, so PTAR. And that should do it. Now, this repo item doesn't exist, so we're going to create that. Let's just bring it in here. So repo item from, and it's going to be in the same folder. The file exists, we just haven't added anything to it yet. So inside repo item, let's do RACF, and it's going to be passed in a single repo within its props. So we'll say repo, and we're also going to want to bring in prop types here since it has a prop, and we'll add that down here. Okay, so this is going to be prop types. Why am I typing it out? PT. It's going to be an object and required. Okay, so this isn't going to be too difficult. We just want a class. This div will have a class name of card because I want a border and some padding around it. And then we'll just do an H3 with a link to the actual URL, which is going to be repo.html_URL, and then for the text it'll be the repo.name. Okay, so the last thing we should have to do is just bring this into our user component. So let's go right here and let's import repos from let's see, we want to go outside of that into repos and then repos, and then we'll just put that down here. Now we are passing in the repos into the user component right here, and I forgot to add that as a prop type. So let's put that here, repos, and it's an array, PTAR. Okay, and that's what we want to pass into the component repos. So down at the bottom here, let's see, we're just gonna go right above where the fragment ends, and let's put in our repos component and pass them in. Okay, let's see, repos is not exported from. Did I not save this? Let's see, do I not have the right path? Port. Oh, I put curly braces around this. It's a default export, so we don't want curly braces. Okay, so user.js repos is not defined. That's because it shouldn't just be repos. It's part of our props, which we can actually pull out right here. There we go. So now if we go back, we have all of our latest 5 repos. If I click one, it should bring us to that actual page. Good. So let's visit another user. Okay. All right. So as far as functionality, our application is finished. Now, there's a better way to do what we've done. Instead of having everything crammed in this app.js like we've done, we can use a state manager, and we can use we could use Redux if we wanted to, but I'm going to go ahead and use the context API. But before we do that, before we get into context, I'm going to convert everything to a functional component and I'm going to introduce a couple hooks to you. One is use state, which allows you to have state in your functional component, and then also use effect, which will allow us to basically mimic lifecycle methods. So for instance, inside our user component, we're calling these methods when the component mounts. Now we can't use component did mount inside of a functional component, but there's a hook called use effect that will give us the same kind of functionality. Okay, so in the next section, we're going to refactor everything into functional components, and then we're going to start to work with the context API, and there's two other hooks that we'll be using. One is use context, and one is use reducer. Okay, so we'll look into that next.